The Galactic Military Academy on Vinar Prime was the largest school for warriors in all of known space, and it had students from 37 different alien species who all believed their own fighters were the best in the universe. The great amphitheater could hold 12,000 beings, and today every seat was full because Professor Kethrall was giving his famous lecture on combat studies, and everyone wanted to hear what he would say about the newest species to join galactic civilization. Kethrall was a Vornathi, which meant he stood over 3 meters tall and had shiny scales covering his body, and 4 arms that could each hold a different weapon. And he was considered one of the smartest military minds in the galaxy. Behind him, giant holographic screens showed numbers and charts from 100 different wars across known space, and the students watched with great interest as he began to speak. Today we will study the newest species to join our compact, Kethrall announced, and his deep voice echoed through the massive room. They call themselves humans, and their elite ground fighters are called Marines. Laughter broke out in several sections of the amphitheater, and the Kreth delegation, which were massive beetle-like creatures covered in natural armor, clicked their jaws together in amusement, and the Silvari, who were tall and beautiful beings that had ruled galactic warfare for 3,000 years, looked at each other with knowing smiles. A young Silvari student named Telin raised his hand, and when Kethrall pointed to him, he stood up with confidence in his voice. "Professor, why should we waste our time studying a species that has only had space travel for 60 years, and their technology is primitive, and their bodies are soft and weak, and they have no natural weapons like claws or armor?" More laughter filled the room, and many students nodded in agreement, because everyone knew that humans were the newest and supposedly the weakest species in the compact. Kethrall did not smile or frown, but simply said, "That is an excellent question, and let us look at the facts." The holographic display changed to show a small blue and green planet floating in space around an ordinary yellow star. This is Earth, and it is the 3rd planet from their sun, and its gravity is a bit stronger than the galactic average, and the air is made of oxygen and nitrogen, and the species that lives there evolved as what we call persistence predators on a world that our scientists have classified as a Category 7 death world. The laughter stopped immediately, and a heavy silence fell over the amphitheater, because everyone knew what those words meant. To help you understand, Kethrall continued, the Silvari homeworld is Category 2, which is considered very safe, and the Kreth evolved on a Category 4 world, which we thought was extreme until we met the humans. Massive creature with rows of sharp teeth and dead black eyes, and it was swimming through dark water. This creature is called a great white shark, and it is not even the most dangerous predator in Earth's oceans, he said, and then showed a picture of a spotted cat with powerful muscles. This is called a leopard, and humans share territory with this animal, and they consider meeting one to be annoying rather than deadly, and their children are taught to identify poisonous snakes and toxic plants and dangerous animals as part of their basic education before they even become adults. The amphitheater had become completely silent, and 12,000 beings were staring at the images with new understanding. "But today we are here to discuss their Marines specifically," Kethrall said. "Private First Class Danny Ortega, would you please stand up?" In the middle section where the small Earth delegation sat, a human rose to his feet, and he was not particularly large by human standards standing, perhaps 180 centimeters tall with brown skin and dark hair cut very short, and he wore the formal uniform of the United Earth Marine Corps, with several medals on his chest. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if standing in front of 12,000 alien warriors was no different than standing in line for food. "Private Ortega has been assigned to our academy as part of the exchange program between species," Kethrall explained. "He is 22 years old and has served as a Marine for 3 years, and he has agreed to answer questions about human military capabilities." Talon, the young Sylvari, spoke again, and his voice was dismissive and mocking. "Tell us, human, what is your kill ratio, and how many enemies have you personally killed in battle?" Danny looked at the Sylvari for a long moment, and his brown eyes were calm and steady. And when he spoke, his voice carried easily through the silent amphitheater, without any need for. "Personally, in my 3 combat deployments, I have been credited with 87 confirmed kills." The number hung in the air like a physical thing, and nobody moved or spoke. A Kreth delegate shifted forward in his seat, and his armored body made scraping sounds against the stone. "That number must be from all 3 deployments combined, yes? And it must include kills made with vehicle weapons and orbital bombardment support." "No, sir," Danny replied, and his voice remained calm and even. 87 personal kills in infantry combat, and that number does not include the times I called in airstrikes or artillery support, because those kills go to the pilots and gunners. Professor Kethral nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. "And what is the average kill count for an Earth Marine with similar deployment experience as yourself?" "I am actually below average, sir," Danny said. "My friend Carlos has 112 confirmed kills. But he is pure infantry, and I am a combat medic, so I spend more time fixing wounds than making them." The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the soft hum of the holographic projectors. Talon had stopped smiling, and his elegant face showed something that might have been the beginning of fear. "That is impossible," a Vornathi officer called out from the back of the amphitheater. "No soft-bodied species without natural weapons could achieve such numbers against armed opponents." Danny turned to look at the officer, and something shifted in his expression. And for just a moment, he did not look like a friendly young soldier answering questions, and instead he looked like something older and more dangerous. "Permission to speak freely, Professor?" Danny asked. Kethral nodded. "Your species and every other species in this room evolved on worlds where you were the top predator," Danny said. "The Sylvari are fast, and the Kreth are armored. The Vornathi are strong, and you all developed your fighting styles based on those natural advantages." He paused and looked around the amphitheater at thousands of alien faces. "Humans have no natural advantages, and we are not the fastest, or the strongest, or the toughest, and we do not have armor, or claws, or venom. And on our world, we were surrounded by things that could kill us every single day." His voice remained calm, but something in his tone made several nearby aliens lean away from him. "So we learned to think, and we learned to plan, and we learned to make tools and weapons, and we learned that anything can be killed if you are smart enough, and patient enough, and willing to pay the price." Danny sat back down and folded his hands in his lap, and his expression returned to friendly and relaxed, as if he had been discussing the weather instead of death. In the front row, Talon stared at the human with new eyes, and the mocking smile was completely gone. His face. Professor Kethral let the silence stretch for several seconds before speaking again. "I believe we will need to schedule additional sessions on this topic," he said. Class dismissed. As 12,000 students filed out of the amphitheater, many of them kept glancing back at the small human sitting calmly among his delegation, and wondering what else they did not know about the newest species to join the galaxy. 3 days after the lecture in the amphitheater, the Academy arranged a practical demonstration, because several senior delegates from different species refused to believe the numbers they had heard, and they demanded proof. The Combat Simulation Dome was the finest training facility in the entire quadrant, and it could create any environment, and any enemy, and any battle scenario using advanced holographic technology that felt completely real to anyone inside. Today, the observation galleries around the dome were packed with representatives from every major species, plus thousands more watching through holographic relays across the galaxy, because word had spread quickly about the human marine and his claims. Danny walked into the center of the dome, wearing his standard combat uniform, and carrying only a rifle and a sidearm and a combat knife, and he had no power armor or energy shields, or any of the advanced technology that other species considered essential for combat. The simulation will put Private Ortega against a standard Sylvari combat squad, the announcer explained. 6 elite warriors fully armed and armored, using the same equipment they would carry into real battle. In the front row of the observation gallery, Tellan sat with his arms crossed, and his expression showed that he expected to see the human fail. And perhaps he even hoped for it, because his pride still stung from the lecture 3 days ago. The dome flickered, and suddenly the empty space transformed into a dense forest, with purple leaves and strange plants, and 2 orange suns casting long shadows through the canopy above. Danny immediately dropped to one knee, and his rifle came up to his shoulder, and his eyes began scanning the terrain around him, with quick, precise movements. At the far edge of the dome, 6 Sylvari warriors appeared, and they were beautiful and terrifying at the same time, with their silver armor gleaming in the orange light, plasma lances humming with deadly energy, and each one was a graduate of the Sylvari Warrior Academy with decades of training. They moved in perfect formation, spreading out to surround their prey, and their movements were graceful and silent, like predators closing in for an easy kill. Danny did not move from his position, and his breathing slowed and his heart rate dropped as he let the sounds of the forest wash over him. And the Marines had a saying that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. The first Sylvari warrior died without ever knowing he had been targeted, and one moment he was gliding between trees, confident in his superior speed and reflexes, and the next moment a single bullet punched through his helmet at exactly the spot where the armor was weakest. Humans had identified that weak point within weeks of first studying Sylvari technology, because finding weaknesses was what humans did best. The sound of the gunshot reached the other Sylvari warriors half a second after their companion fell, and they immediately opened fire on the position where they had seen the muzzle flash. But Danny was already moving, and he rolled behind a fallen log as energy blasts scorched the air where he had been kneeling. And then he was up and running, not away from the Sylvari, but directly toward them. He moved in a zigzag pattern that seemed random, but was actually calculated to make it almost impossible for the Sylvari to aim properly. And their superior reflexes meant nothing, if they could not predict where their target would be. The second Sylvari warrior had just enough time to see the human approaching before a thrown knife buried itself in his throat, and the Sylvari had never considered the throat a viable target, because their own warriors would never get close enough for such an attack. Danny caught the falling warrior's plasma lance as the body dropped, and he fired twice from the hip, and a third Sylvari collapsed, with 2 smoking holes in his chest armor. And then the weapon's safety systems recognized an unauthorized user, and locked itself. 3 warriors down in 11 seconds. The remaining 3 Sylvari did something that their species had never done in 3,000 years of military dominance across the galaxy. They retreated. Danny let them run, and he did not chase them directly, but instead circled through the undergrowth with movements that were silent and efficient. And the Sylvari had better hearing than humans and better eyesight and faster reflexes. But what they did not have was 60 million years of evolution that had turned every human into a natural ambush predator. He found them regrouping in a small clearing with their backs against a rock formation, and it was a good defensive position, and tactically it made sense. Danny smiled in the shadows of the purple forest. He had spent the last 2 minutes not just tracking the Sylvari, but also studying the small creatures that lived in this simulated environment, and now he picked up a rock and threw it hard at a nest hanging from a nearby tree. The swarm that exploded from the nest looked like a cross between wasps and small dogs, and they were angry and loud, and they headed straight for the Sylvari warriors. The creatures were not actually dangerous to humans, because human skin was too thick and human immune systems were too strong. But for the Sylvari, who had evolved on a peaceful world with nothing more aggressive than butterflies, the psychological impact was devastating. Two of the warriors broke formation and started swatting at the creatures buzzing around their heads, and their careful defensive stance fell apart completely. Danny shot them both with clean headshots before they even realized what was happening. The last Sylvari warrior held her ground, and she saw Danny emerge from the tree line, and she raised her plasma lance to fire. Because everyone knew Sylvari reflexes were superior to human reflexes. But Danny had started pulling his trigger before she finished raising her weapon, because he had known with absolute certainty that she would try to fire the moment she saw him. And humans had learned long ago that you did not need to be faster if you could predict what your enemy would do. The Sylvari fired her lance at the spot where Danny had been standing. Danny was no longer there, because he had already moved. His bullet took her through the eye, and she fell without making a sound. The dome flickered and reset to neutral gray, and in the observation gallery, 12,000 beings sat in complete and total silence. Danny ejected the magazine from his rifle, checked the chamber, put the safety on, and his heart rate had elevated to maybe 90 beats per minute, which was nothing compared to some of the training exercises he had done in boot camp. "Simulation complete," announcer said, and his voice was shaking slightly. Time elapsed 4 minutes and 37 seconds, and human casualties 0, and Sylvari casualties 6 of 6. In the front row, Tellin was staring at the human with wide eyes, and his earlier confidence had completely disappeared. A Kreth delegate stood up, and his massive armored body blocked the view of several smaller beings behind him. The simulation must have been altered to favor the human. Danny looked up at the observation gallery, and his expression was calm and almost friendly. "Then send real warriors, and we can do it again." Nobody responded to his offer. Professor Kethril stood slowly, and his forearms were folded in a gesture that indicated deep thought. "I believe we need to expand our curriculum regarding human military capabilities." Danny walked out of the dome, and several beings in the corridors moved aside to let him pass, even though he was smaller than most of them. Evening. Tellin found Danny sitting alone in the Academy's garden, and the human was looking up at the stars with a peaceful expression on his face. "May I join you?" Tellin asked. Danny nodded and shifted to make room on the bench. They sat in silence for a while, and then Tellin spoke. "I underestimated your species." "Everyone does," Danny replied, "at first." "What was it like in there?" Tellin asked. "Were you scared?" Danny considered the question carefully. "Not really scared, because I have trained for situations like that hundreds of times, but I was focused and alert, because overconfidence gets people killed." 6 elite warriors, Tellin said softly, in less than 5 minutes. "They were good fighters," Danny said, "but they fought the way they were trained to fight, and they expected me to fight the same way, because that is how wars work for most species." He looked at the Sylvari, and his eyes reflected the light of distant stars. "Not fight the way we are expected to fight," Danny said. "We fight to win." The requests for more lectures about humans started coming in within hours of the combat demonstration, and by the end of the first week, Professor Kethril had completely reorganized his entire teaching schedule to focus on human military history. The amphitheater was once again packed with students from every species, and this time there was no laughter or mockery when Danny walked to the podium, and instead there was careful attention and perhaps a little fear. "Before we begin today," Kethril announced, "Private Ortega has asked to address a common misunderstanding that he has noticed among the questions he has received, and Private Ortega, the floor is yours." Danny walked to the center of the stage, and his boots made soft sounds on the ancient stone, and he looked out at the thousands of faces watching him. "Some of you have suggested that the combat demonstration was unfair," he began. "You have said that I had advanced knowledge of Sylvari tactics, or that the simulation was programmed to help me, or that one fight does not prove anything about human capabilities." He paused and let the silence stretch, You are right that one fight proves nothing, and so today, we are going to talk about history. The holographic display behind him changed to show a planet covered with long ditches in the ground, and tangled metal wire, and mud everywhere. Earth year 1916, Danny said. A conflict we called the First World War, and in one battle called the Somme, humans suffered over 1 million casualties in about 4 months of fighting. And when it was finally over, both sides claimed they had won, and the next year they did it again. Murmurs spread through the audience, because 1 million was a number that most species could not imagine losing in a single battle. The display changed to show massive mushroom-shaped clouds rising into the sky. Earth year 1945, Danny continued. Humans developed weapons that could destroy entire cities with a single explosion, and within 20 years, we had built enough of these weapons to destroy our entire planet several times over. And we called this strategy mutually assured destruction, and it was considered a reasonable approach to keeping peace. The murmurs grew louder, and several delegates looked disturbed. You gave yourselves the ability to destroy your own world, a Kreth officer called out, and you considered this reasonable? It worked, Danny replied simply. For over a century it prevented major wars between the nations that had these weapons, because everyone knew that starting a war would mean the end of everything. The display changed again to show a small fleet of human ships meeting alien vessels for the first time. Earth year 2089, Danny said. First contact with the Galactic Compact, and you gave us faster-than-light travel, and you welcomed us as the newest members of your civilization, and you assumed we would be the weakest. We were so new, he smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Within 5 years we had taken apart your weapons, and figured out how they worked, and then made them better. And within 10 years we had found weak points in the military technology of every major species. And within 15 years, the Compact asked us to help fight the Harrock incursion, because nobody else could stop them. The display showed insect-like creatures swarming across the planet's surface, in numbers too large to count. The Harrock had conquered 37 worlds before we got involved, Danny explained. Their swarm tactics were considered impossible to defeat, and the average Compact defense against them resulted in 90% casualties before the defenders had to retreat. He pulled up a new set of images showing human Marines in combat armor. The Battle of Kepler 442b, he said, 3,000 Earth Marines against approximately 2 million Harrock warriors, and the fighting lasted 6. He paused and looked around the silent amphitheater. Human casualties were 312 killed and 700 wounded, and Harrock casualties were total, which means every single one of the 2 million was eliminated. And we did not just defeat them. We broke their entire species, and they surrendered completely 3 weeks later. A Vornathi delegate raised one of his forearms. How is that possible? And what tactics could achieve such a result against such overwhelming numbers? We do not fight fair, Danny said simply. We have never fought fair because our entire history as a species has been one long lesson in how to kill things that are bigger and stronger and faster than we are. He began walking slowly across the stage. We learned to make tools when our claws were not sharp enough, and we learned to set traps when we could not catch our prey. And we learned to use fire and poison and disease as weapons, and when we ran out of things to kill on Earth, we started killing each other, which taught us even more. He stopped and turned to face the audience directly. Every species in this room has built their military based on their evolutionary advantages, and the Sylvari are fast, so they built tactics around speed, and the Kreth have natural armor, so they built tactics around absorbing damage, and the Vornathi are strong with 4 arms, so they built tactics around overwhelming force. Danny's voice remained calm, but something in his tone made the nearest audience members uncomfortable. Humans have no evolutionary advantages for combat, because we are not stronger or faster or tougher than most species we encounter. And so instead we learned to think, and we learned to adapt, and we learned that any weapon can be defeated, and any tactic can be countered, and any advantage can be neutralized, if you are willing to work hard enough. He looked directly at Tellen, who was sitting in the same spot as before. You asked about kill ratios, and here is the truth, because the number itself does not matter. And what matters is that every human Marine has been trained to treat war as a problem to be solved, rather than a contest to be won. And we do not care about honor or tradition, and we care about completing our mission and bringing our people home alive. The amphitheater was completely silent. The average Sylvari warrior trains for 6 years before seeing real combat, Danny continued. The average Kreth soldier is born already knowing how to fight because of genetic memory, and the average Vornathi takes 10 years to master all forearms in combat. He paused. The average human Marine completes basic training in 13 weeks. Shocked whispers filled the room. 13 weeks is enough, Danny said, because we are not teaching them how to fight in those 13 weeks, and we are teaching them how to think. And a human who knows how to think is the most dangerous thing in the universe. He walked back to the center of the stage. Every human alive carries 60 million years of survival instincts in their blood. And every human child grows up on a world where the weather can kill you, and the animals can kill you, and the plants can kill you, and even the water can kill you if you are not careful. His voice dropped slightly, but it still carried through the silent room. We do not train humans to be killers because we already are killers, and we train them to be precise and disciplined, and to direct that killing ability towards specific targets rather than everything around them. Professor Kethril stood slowly. Thank you, Private Ortega, and I believe this information requires significant reflection from all of us. As the students began to file out, many of them looked at Danny differently than they had before, and there was a new understanding in their eyes. Humans were not the weakest species in the world. Compact, they might be the most dangerous. The formal challenge came from a source that surprised everyone at the Academy, and it was not from the Sylvari or the Kreth, but from the Vornathi, who were the same species as Professor Kethril. Commander Rathven was a living legend among his people, and he had fought in 16 major wars, and he had never lost a single duel in his entire career. And his forearms could each wield a different weapon with equal skill, and his scales were covered with scars from hundreds of battles. He stood before the full assembly, and his deep voice echoed through the amphitheater. I mean no disrespect to the human warrior, because he has proven himself capable, but demonstrations against simulations prove nothing about real combat ability. The Vornathi delegation rumbled with approval, and their scales rattled against each other like stones clicking together. I challenge Private Ortega to single combat, Rathven announced, under traditional Vornathi rules. Rules meant no guns or ranged weapons of any kind, and only blades would be allowed, and this was clearly designed to take away what the Vornathi believed was humanity's greatest advantage. Danny stood up slowly from his seat. What are the stakes? He asked. Honor, Rathven replied, and the answer to one question if you survive. And that question is, what makes humans believe they have any place among the warrior races of the galaxy? And if I win? Danny asked. Rathven's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. If you win, human, you may ask anything of me, and I will answer truthfully. Danny nodded. I accept your challenge. The combat arena was ancient beyond measure, and it had been carved from the living rock of Venar Prime itself, and thousands of years of Vornathi blood had soaked into its stones, and the observation platforms around it were filled with delegates from every species. Danny entered the arena wearing only his standard uniform, carrying his combat knife, which was 15 centimeters of high-carbon steel, and the same basic design that Marines had carried for over 200 years. Rathven entered in full ceremonial armor that gleamed under the lights, and each of his forearms carried a curved blade that hummed with energy. and he looked like a god of war compared to the small human across from him. "You may still withdraw," Rathven offered. "There is no dishonor in recognizing when you face a superior opponent." Danny settled into a fighting stance, with his knife held low. "I appreciate your concern, but let us begin." The Vornathai moved first, and his attack was a blinding combination of strikes from all four arms at the same time, and any other species would have been completely overwhelmed because it was impossible to track so many weapons at once. Danny did not try to track them individually, because he had spent the past week studying recordings of Vornathai combat. Something interesting, and for all their four-armed coordination, their attacks followed predictable patterns. The Vornathi had evolved to fight creatures that reacted to individual threats, and no one had ever taught them to fight something that could anticipate their patterns before they finished making them. Danny stepped inside the arc of all four blades, and he accepted a shallow cut across his shoulder to put himself exactly where he needed to be, and then he drove his knife upward through a gap in Rathven's chest armor. The wound was not fatal, because human blades were too short to reach a Vornathi's hearts, but the pain was real, and Rathven's perfect rhythm stuttered for just a moment. That moment was all Danny needed. He dropped low and swept at the Vornathi's legs, not hard enough to knock him down, but just enough to force him to shift his balance. And as Rathven adjusted, Danny was already moving, and using the commander's own body as a shield against two of his arms, while engaging the other two. The fighting became brutal and ugly, and Danny took a deep cut across his ribs and another across his thigh, and blood soaked through his uniform and dripped onto the ancient stones. But every wound he received he traded for a wound on the Vornathi, and Rathven began to bleed from a dozen different cuts. Humans did not stop fighting when they were wounded, and every species was learning this lesson now, and instead humans fought harder when they were hurt, as if pain made them more dangerous rather than less. 3 minutes into the fight, Rathven was bleeding heavily, and his movements had slowed, and his breathing was labored, and his species had a fast metabolism that was usually an advantage, but now it was working against him, because he was burning through his energy reserves faster than his body could replace them. Danny was also bleeding, and also slowing, but he had trained for exactly this situation. Learned to fight through pain and exhaustion, and to ignore the body's desperate signals to stop, because the human body could survive far more than it wanted to. When Rathven's guard finally dropped, just for a fraction of a second, Danny struck. His knife found the gap between the Vornathi's neck plates, because every species had that same weak point, since every species needed to be able to turn its head. Rathven froze, with the blade a centimeter away from his major blood vessels. "Yield," Danny said quietly. The arena was silent, and thousands of beings held their breath. Then Rathven dropped all four of his blades, and they clattered against the ancient stone. "I yield," he said. The crowd erupted not in celebration, but in shock, because they had just watched the greatest warrior the Vornathi had ever produced lose to a human with nothing but a simple knife. Medical teams rushed onto the arena floor, but Danny waved them toward Rathven first, because the Vornathi needed treatment more urgently than he did. As the commander was carried away, Danny limped to the center of the arena, and blood dripped from his wounds and pooled on stones that had seen only Vornathi blood for thousands of years. "You owe me an answer to a question," Danny called out. Rathven paused and turned his head, despite the protests of the medics working on him. "Ask," he said. "Why did you really challenge me?" "Because it was not about honor, and I want the real reason." Rathven was silent for a long moment, and then he spoke, and his voice was tired but honest. "Fear," he said. "I needed to know if humans could be beaten." Danny nodded slowly. "And now you know the answer." "Yes," the commander replied, and something new entered his voice that might have been respect or perhaps acceptance. "Now I know that humans can be beaten, but the cost of beating them may be higher than any species is willing to pay." turned and walked out of the arena, and he did not look back. In the observation gallery, Professor Kethrall watched the human leave, and he realized that everything he thought he knew about military power and warrior species was wrong. The next day, Danny received messages from 17 different species requesting formal military exchanges with Earth, and 3 of them offered alliance treaties. The galaxy was beginning to understand that humans were not just another species to be managed or contained. They were something new and something dangerous and something that could not be ignored. The graduation ceremony at the end of the academic year was the largest in the entire history of the Galactic Military Academy. And every seat in the great amphitheater was filled, and thousands more watched through holographic relays from dozens of worlds across the compact. Professor Kethrall stood at the podium, and his forearms were folded in a gesture of formal address, and behind him, the holographic displays showed images from the past year of study. "This year we have learned much about our newest members," he began, and his voice carried through the massive space. "We have learned that their bodies, which we thought were soft, are actually capable of enduring tremendous punishment, and we have learned that their minds, which we thought were primitive, are actually capable of solving problems that have defeated older species for thousands of years." He paused and looked out at the assembled students. "We have learned that their warriors, which we assumed were inferior, are actually capable of defeating our finest fighters. But the most important lesson we have learned is not about human capabilities." The display changed to show images from human history, with soldiers in trenches, and medics treating wounded, and civilians carrying weapons. "It is about our own assumptions." Kethrall gestured toward the small Earth delegation sitting in their section. "Humans do not separate their warriors from their ordinary citizens the way we do, and any human can become a soldier. And their history is filled with stories of farmers picking up weapons, and children learning to fight, and entire populations mobilizing for war." He straightened to his full impressive height. "They do not breed special warrior classes or select for combat ability, because they believe that the capacity for violence exists in every human being. And based on what we have observed this year, they are correct." Danny shifted uncomfortably in his seat, because he had not expected to become a teaching example. "Private Ortega is not exceptional among his species," Kethrall continued. "He is average, and you must remember that, because every human you meet has the potential to be what he is, and every human has been shaped by the same violent history, and the same fundamental understanding that the universe is dangerous, and that survival must be earned through struggle." The professor let the silence stretch for several seconds. The question that began this year of study was, what is the kill ratio for one Earth Marine? And the answer of 87 personal kills shocked us all. But I have come to realize that we asked the wrong question. His gaze swept across the 12,000 faces watching him. "The correct question is, what would humans do if they decided we were a threat? And the answer, based on everything we have learned, is simple, because they would find a way to win, not through superior numbers, better technology, but through adaptability and persistence and an absolute refusal to accept defeat." The display changed to show the simple blue and green sphere of Earth floating in space. The Galactic Compact has spent 3,000 years believing that military power comes from evolutionary advantages, and the Silvari are fast, and the Kreth are armored, and the Vornathi are strong. But humans have taught us that military power actually comes from the mind. He paused again. "From the willingness to think differently, and to adapt constantly, and to endure more than should be possible." Kethrall raised all 4 of his arms in a gesture of formal recognition. "I ask this assembly to welcome humanity to the Compact, not as the youngest species and not as the weakest species, but as equals. Because any species that can turn weakness into strength, and that can create warriors from ordinary people in 13 weeks, and that can face the greatest fighters in the galaxy, with nothing but a knife and a calm expression, has earned their place among us. Danny stood with the rest of the Earth delegation, as the entire assembly rose in acknowledgement, and around him, representatives from 37 species were looking at humans in a way they never had before. Not with contempt, and not with pity, but with the careful awareness of beings who had just realized they were sharing the universe with something they did not fully understand. Later, as the crowds dispersed, Tellin found Danny standing alone near one of the Academy's windows, looking out at the stars. "I have wanted to speak with you before you leave," Tellin said. Danny turned and nodded. "What is on your mind?" "I owe you an apology because I underestimated your species, and I was wrong." "Everybody does," Danny replied. "At first, anyway." Tellin moved to stand beside the human, and they both looked out at the countless stars scattered across the air. "Darkness. May I ask you something honestly?" Tellin said. "Go ahead. During everything that happened this year, the simulation and the duel and all the questions you answered, were you ever afraid that you might fail?" Danny considered the question seriously before answering. "Worried a little, maybe because overconfidence is dangerous, but not really afraid. And the thing about being human is that we grew up on a planet that tried to kill us every single day." He gestured at the stars outside. "Everything wanted us dead, including the weather and the animals and the diseases, and even other humans. And after 60 million years of the universe throwing everything it could at us, we are still here." He turned to look at the Sylvari, and for a moment, Tellin saw something behind the friendly expression, and it was something ancient and patient and absolutely relentless. "We do not spend much time worrying about losing," Danny said. He clapped Tellin on the shoulder in a friendly way, and then walked off down the corridor, leaving the Sylvari standing alone at the window. Tellin watched the human go, and thought about everything he had witnessed over the past year. And he realized that the galaxy would never be quite the same now that humans were part of it. In his office, Professor Kethral was preparing his notes for next year's curriculum, and he had already received requests from 23 worlds asking for copies of his lectures on human military history. He looked at the image of Earth on his display screen, and wondered what would happen in the years to come as humanity spread further into the galaxy. They had been part of the compact for only 60 years, and already they had changed everything. He suspected they were just getting started. Outside the Academy's windows, the stars continued their ancient dance, and somewhere among them, a small blue planet circled an ordinary, yellow sun, and on that planet, billions of humans went about their daily lives. Most of them would never travel to the stars, and most of them would never fight in a war, and most of them would live quiet, ordinary lives. But every single one of them carried the same potential that Danny Ortega had demonstrated, and every single one of them was the product of the same violent evolutionary history. The galaxy had welcomed humanity as the newest and supposedly weakest member of galactic civilization. That assumption was the biggest mistake the Compact had ever made. And somewhere in the depths of space, the Compact's enemies were beginning to realize this too. The age of human expansion was only beginning, and the universe would never be the same.